Thanks, everybody, so much for joining us. My name is Shana Marshall. I'm the Associate Director of the Institute for Middle East Studies here at GW. And we're very excited to have with us today Joe Khalil, who is Associate Professor of Global Media at Northwestern University in Qatar, and currently a visiting scholar here at GW's Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication. His research and teaching focus on understanding changes and continuities in the media, with a particular focus on Middle East youth. He is committed to an interdisciplinary and transnational approach to understanding mainstream and alternative media. His research probes media industries, production studies, social movements, and digital cultures. His publications include The Digital Double Bind, Oxford University Press, The Handbook of Media and Culture in the Middle East, with Wiley Blackwell, Culture, Time, and Publics in the Arab World from Ivy Taurus, Arab Television Industries from Palgrave, and Arab Satellite Entertainment Television and Public Diplomacy from Smith Richardson. It's a wonderful list of publications, quite extensive. And then he will be in discussion today with our own Will Humans, who is Associate Professor at GW in the School of Media and Public Affairs, broadly interested in questions of transnationalism, power, and communication. His primary interests include global news, law, and politics. And I think he just told me to cut off the extremely lengthy intro, so we can go ahead and get started. If you guys have questions on the Zoom, please put them in the Q&A, and then we'll have, of course, an in-person Q&A at the end of the discussion. In terms of future events, we do have a lot of upcoming events. One, Dear Palestine, A Social History of the 1948 War with Shai Hazkani, who's here in person in the audience with us today. And then on April 16th, we have The Achilles Trap, Saddam Hussein, the CIA, and the Origins of America's Invasion of Iraq with Steve Cole. That's part of the Middle East Policy Forum. Several other events related to Palestine. Please, they're all on our website. You can go to just Google IMES, GWU events, including our upcoming annual conference, and you'll find all that information readily available there. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for taking the time on this first day of spring to be here, both online and in person. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you, Shana, for the kind introduction. Thanks for your hospitality at the Institute, and also for graciously accepting to be the discussant today. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce a new book I co-authored with Mohamed Zayani. The book's title is The Digital Double Bind, and the subtitle, very appropriate for AMIS, is Change and Stasis in the Middle East. Now, you may be wondering, like many of my colleagues did and do, where did the title come from? Well, we borrowed it from we borrowed the term double bind from the British anthropologist George Matheson to capture what we believe is the most salient feature of the digital Middle East. We chose the double bind mainly because Catch-22 was already taken, and damned if you do, damned if you don't sounds more like a self-help book, which this one certainly isn't. So. As for the subtitle, Change and Stasis in the Middle East, over the years, Mohamed and I have found ourselves sharing anecdotes about how digital tools are changing or reshaping lives in the region. Take my friend Omar, who, unlike me, is a stickler for punctuality. In the old days, many of you may have shared that type of experiences. He would honk his car just to make sure that I'm there waiting for him. When he owned his first mobile phone, he shifted to what we at the time referred to as the missed call era. So he would give me a ring, make sure that I'm, he would ring and then hang up immediately, making sure that I'm downstairs waiting for him. Now he's kind of like changed the whole thing. He's become a whole adept of sharing his location on WhatsApp, making sure that I'm there, not making him wait. So in other words, what we were seeing at the beginning was that sort of technology's changed, but people's habits stay remarkably constant. While these anecdotes reflected our experiences living and working in the region, countless other stories, some of them are very inspiring. Others are very perplexing, sparked our research interests. Stories about city-states, like the case of Dubai and its digital ventures in the metaverse, or ones about applications like a local e-commerce platform called Souq, which Amazon acquired when they ventured into the region. But other stories about criminalizing specific tools like the use of VPNs, without convincing rationale, or how routinely social media users are called in before courts for simply using platforms to earn money, like the case of the Egyptians TikTok girls. So today, what I'll touch on are some of the region's encounters with the digital, focusing on the Arab Middle East and highlighting key concepts and dynamics from our research. Now, the digital Middle East has been a long time in the making. We can go back, but there's always, in the literature, there's always this kind of association of the region undergoing what some called a series of revolutions, or others called a sort of a one big revolution. There's something about the area with revolutions, which something I'll come back to later in this talk. But these approaches to technology and change tend to frame the region as playing catch up with the West, while other approaches focus on binaries of underdevelopment and development. Ultimately, what this leads to is within these types of approaches is a way of universalizing the digital or orientalizing the Middle East. One example for to think about is how the region's largest music streaming service, Anghami, which translates into My Tunes, is dubbed as the Spotify of the Middle East, making it a copycat of global digital media, while at the same time being used as a kind of an exotic innovation in an otherwise backward region. Similarly, one could also consider how the region's naming of digital spaces like Silicon Oasis perpetuates a universalization of the digital that centers the West as its referent. What we wanted to do is, as we started thinking about how the digital is incorporated in everyday life, we started thinking about how the impact of the digital on everyday life is undeniable. Different engagements with the digital happen in different places, in different ways, and with different outcomes. What our book tries to do is trace these engagements across different scales: the technological, the sociocultural, political, and economic. So what we try to do is explore how and what such impact means in terms of infrastructures, states, markets, and publics. And this is broadly the division of the book. Though these are familiar categories, they are also very complex. For example, infrastructures include not only undersea cables, for example, but also local, regional, and global institutions that uphold them. States are not just geopolitical entities, but also substantial economic and regulatory players. Markets are not only the famous family-owned businesses that are widespread around the region, but also small startups and large multi-million-dollar digital platforms. And finally, publics are not only the Arab Street crowds with mobile phones that we've seen a lot of over the last decade, but also sophisticated digital users and consumers of tools and content. It's these different complexities that we try to account for in our work. Yet, the digital impact on the region should not be taken for granted, nor it be considered as uniform. It has largely been shaped by the region's geographies, diverse demographics, access levels, and types of affordances. This is one of the challenges of writing about the digital from outside the typical network societies. The digital divide between and within Arab states is real, Internet costs vary significantly, ranging from 0.5% to 12% of individual income. Additionally, there's a stark contrast in technological advancement from countries that have pioneered 5G networks to ones that are still operating on 3G. Some countries embrace e-government, while others lack basic e-payment options, exacerbating issues like financial inclusion. So the first concept that we want to sort of introduce is the digital turn. And we use that to capture these types of dynamics that we're seeing. So the digital turn, as we term it, represents a process of incremental societal changes associated with the digital, yet irreducible to a straightforward technological transformation. What characterizes this digital turn is that it is incomplete and it is also uneven. In a way, we have not left the analog era and are not yet fully in the digital era. So for all the talk about the Arab world, part of the Arab world still stuck in the pre-digital, and some part of the region having moved into a post-digital era, we'd like to see this as a kind of a continuum. And that's why we're referring to this as a digital turn. And within that digital turn, and here I come back to the notion of the revolution. So despite promises of digital revolution, what our research reveals is a more transitional than transformative reality. The digital turn is a layered transition, one that is intertwined with infrastructural, political, economic, and societal dimensions, but which is also riddled with conflicts and contradictions. This prompts a few questions, for example, and these are kind of the questions that we got us started in our research and that we tackle in the book in some way. So some of these questions are: why do most people decry censorship yet advocate for state control over digital media content? How is it that many activists continue to use the very same tools that they know the government uses to track them? How is it that states seek complete immersion in the knowledge economy, which in turn risks empowering a generation with tools that lead to challenge the state's stasis? How come many conservatives who advocate a return to traditions use the same social media tools that have been accused of disrupting the social norms? And this is where we come with the digital double bind, which is the title of the book. Within the digital turn, the state eagerly embraces digital technologies, the market aligns itself accordingly, and the publics dive headfirst into the digital realm. Seems like a recipe for success, right? Well, not quite. You see, these conditions often create conflicting pulls, tugging us in different directions. So the digital double bind posits that the same conditions that drive the immersion of the state, market, and public into the digital also inhibit change and perpetuate stasis. What I'm going to try to do here is give you a little bit of a sense of the book by drawing on chapter 2, titled Reckoning with Change. It addresses how the digital double bind has developed. In one section of this chapter, we emphasize the existence of various perspectives on what the digital entails and how it shapes distinct realities for different individuals over time. So what I'd like to share is this brief excerpt highlighting digital imaginaries and their influence on decision-making. Digital imaginaries are our reflection, thoughts, visions about how technology can change things. That's at least how it's been associated with. On one hand, these ideas lead to specific tools and practices that set us on a path for change. But there's a kind of a kicker there. Those same ideas can actually work against and change when used with different intentions. The result is imperfect, often false choices. Whatever actors choose as a path for change alters their own proclaimed objectives. So imaginaries constructed around digital technologies are produced through a complex process involving a range of stakeholders, including states, markets, publics, institutions, interest groups, and individuals who operate at the intersection of local, regional, and global levels. Digital imaginaries are intimately connected with history, political economy, and sociality. These can take any form. They could be articulated in neoliberal digital policies that often reflect the encroachment of digital capitalism as evinced in the region's startup culture. Alternatively, they could be evident in the way marginalized groups, such as youth, women, and minorities, have placed digital tools at the service of their cultural politics. These ways in which particular imaginaries take hold strongly influence the digital Middle East, how the digital Middle East unfolds, and in some ways order the very configurations that animate it. This vintage point allows us to eliminate a prevailing imaginary regarding how digital drives the sociocultural, political, and economic change in the Middle East. The digital is often thought out as a convenient solution to ongoing challenges, as a technological fix to societal problems. A technological elixir proves appealing. Such a cure does not necessarily require unsettling institutional norms, altering cultural dispositions, or changing personal behaviors. Thus fetishized, the digital induces ever-expanding desires that are matched only by the technology's promises. The self-perpetuating nature of technological application and the promise of techno-futures facilitate the integration of digital technologies into different spheres of societal activities. For businesses, a growing array of e-commerce platforms promises on users, user engagements are promoted as sustaining and ever-expanding consumerism. For individuals, growing platforms and enhanced e-services are adopted because of their convenience, time savings, cost effectiveness, and other benefits. For the state, e-government is depicted as a means for curbing public spending, increasing efficiency, and monitoring crime. In all these spheres, the adoption of new technologies is inscribed within an imaginary that considers the digital as a panacea. The ultimate promise is that a leap into the digital will rid the Middle East of its perceived ills. The digital also emerges as an antidote to autocracy and repressive political cultures. During and after the 2011 Arab uprisings, digital technologies came to be perceived as effective tools for political change. Many commentators, journalists, and pundits effusively described the events in Tunisia, Egypt, and beyond as social media revolutions, portraying Facebook and Twitter as engines of regime change and conduits for political transformation. The media turned Wael Ghanem, a Google techie, into the face of the 2011 Egyptian revolution. Ghanem was hurriedly proclaimed as a catalyst for what was dubbed Revolution 2.0. Media discourses such as these, which characterize the uprisings as digitally enabled revolutions, reflect a fervent belief in the power of technology to effect sociopolitical change, even in entrenched clientelistic autocracies. Despite revisionist accounts aiming to rebut such fanfare, the digital acquired a manifest political dimension beyond the momentous events of the uprisings. Whether used by social movement actors as liberation technology, adopted by government surveillance agencies in the form of digital authoritarianism, or deployed by extremist groups and radical organizations as nefarious technologies, the digital has reconfigured how politics are imagined and contested. Irrespective of whether these technologies are liberating or hegemonic, a weighty question in itself, the multiple and incongruous constructs that underpin such discourses are inevitably entangled with digital imaginaries. And the last one, considerable faith has been placed in the ability of the digital to energize the development of the region. The recursive nature of the technology means that newer apps constantly replace existing ones, which often amounts to planned obsolescence. That trait seems to make plausible a digital sublime fantasy that seamless technological progress is possible. One such digital imaginary fueled discourses about individual assertion and group empowerment rooted in the ability of the digital to create private and public spaces where women, young people, and other marginalized communities could express themselves. Another one involved economic growth. Governments promote the digital as a harbinger of development and economic diversification. In this vision, the market fosters digital innovations and that create value, while individuals orient their education and careers toward the digital in pursuit of a better future, thus producing a cycle. For many enthusiasts, the region's observable digital successes provide evidence of how the Global South is replicating Silicon Valley. Venture capital and sovereign wealth funds have encouraged private and state investments in the digital economy, including supporting an incipient startup culture. Across the region, economic free zones for digital sectors have fostered an ecosystem, resulting in a steady stream of deals, investments, and exits. Consider the rise of Careem, generous in Arabic, the region's largest ride-hailing company. Barely 7 years after its modest launch in 2012, Careem boasted the creation of more than 1 million employment opportunities, luring the San Francisco-based Uber to acquire it in a multi-billion-dollar deal. However, such dramatic successes are not common for startups in the Arab Middle East. Most of them are largely concentrated in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. But even there, these companies often face regulatory challenges that inhibit cross-border investments, ownership, and their operation in general. Similarly, the ecosystem that supports them lacks sociocultural, political, and economic embeddedness. The Arab Silicon Valley, if something like this is to exist, is more easily envisioned than achieved. Whether constructed as a technological fix, an empowering tool, or an equalizing force, the digital is ingrained in everyday practices and popular culture, and sustained in political and economic discourses to such a degree that it has become indissociable from the way it is conceived, lived, and experienced. These imaginaries are not fixed in space or time. They are constantly reinvented, readapted, and reappropriated. Acknowledging these imaginaries as interpretive processes through which discourses about the digital are constructed and internalized is another step forward toward grasping the complexities of the digital Middle East. So as I wrap up, I'll give you a glimpse into the structure of the digital double-bind. It is neatly divided into 5 parts, featuring 14 chapters and 321 pages. It's worth every penny, I think. If you want to explore further, I invite you to visit our website, digitaldoublebind.com. There you'll find syllabi, visual tools, a lot of clips that we made, articles, and a lot of other stuff to satisfy your curiosity. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks. It's helpful as a teaching supplement, so that's helpful. Yeah, you didn't tell me about that. I would have.
Well,
exploited that.
Hopefully you get to use it later on.
So thank you. I like being a discussant because it's like being the only student who did the reading in class, you know. Yeah, and I really, one thing I really like about the book is like 14 chapters. They're not long chapters. So you just feel like you're, and the writing is so accessible, like you're just kind of like breezing through it. So it's eminently readable. That's my plug as well.
And
But
it helps with the syllabi.
it helps with the syllabi. Yep.
You can assign a chapter a week.
Yeah. So my first question is kind of like and talking about the digital turn and the digital imaginary, how is it different than past like analog imaginaries? And that, we were talking beforehand about learner, and learners, big thing was about how radio is going to modernize the Middle East. You could look at, Anderson writing about print. Obviously, he's looking at Indonesia and something else, but there was the print turn. And then also, we went from radio and learner in Turkey to, which you write about a little bit about radio and Pan-Arabism. And then obviously broadcasting television and satellite revolution, as you know about. So there's been all these kind of revolutionary discourses around analog technologies. What's different about this one in terms of like larger history of discourses about technology?
That's a really interesting question. Now, let me differentiate. We don't subscribe to the notion of revolution.
Yeah.
We don't subscribe to this notion of transformation.
Right.
And once we subscribe to this notion of a transition, so we think of these as being sort of periodic, and very layered in the way they appear. So one way to think about this is to think about the relationship of the region with technology itself. And to do this, we in chapter 2 we go back to the Nahda movement, which was at in the late 19th century, where many of the it was referred to as the Arab Enlightenment age, where they were looking at the West and seeing the kind of changes that were happening in the West, and it's in the way technology has been sort of incorporated in the region, and they wanted to sort of like cherry pick certain aspects of this type of technology to incorporate in the region. So it's more about a technological relationship of the region with change. So in a way, what you're suggesting is something that we subscribe to, that it's another phase, and the digital is now a turn in the way the region relates to change.
Yeah.
The difference is one of scale, and it's also one of as we go through the book is precisely this notion of the double bind.
Yeah.
Which we believe has become the salient feature of the region's relationship with these types of technology.
Yeah, good. So the bind is a lot more self-reflective of past discourses. If they were really wise thinking about radio, they would have thought about the binds with radio as opposed to just focusing on the liberatory, revolutionary sort of aspects.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's also the way these types of imaginaries come in, because again, radio was thought of as being, as the one that was gonna cause all sorts of things. Satellite television was the first one that was introduced, which is a digital technology.
Yeah.
In so many of its aspects, was also thought of as coming in and changing the region in a kind of a irreversible manner. Whereas those very same technologies are also perpetuating the status that the region was always.
Right. So is it almost helpful to think about it as kind of like a dialectic between optimism and pessimism, like they frequently talk about, or because there's a reason why you chose not to talk about that? So I'm just trying to like tease out the double bind as different than a dialectic or this sort of.
It is on so many levels a dialectic approach, right? The way we try to see it, and that's the kind of definition that we gave to it, is the idea that the very same forces that are used, or the very same tools that are used to promote change are also used perpetuate the kind of stasis that we're in. And we take this all across the various scales. So we discuss various types of technologies that are hailed as or being introduced to promoting the change, while at the same time sustaining the kind of stasis that's there. I mean, we can take a few examples. In the case of politics, for example, you look at the way in the Syrian revolution, which somehow now, with all the events that are happening, somehow have taken a backside, right? The very same tools that the activists were using, they knew that they were while using these tools that the government was using them to track them. Yet they still use them, and that's the kind of double bind that we're monitoring. In places in Tunisia, the government under Ben Ali decided to promote the education promote and introduce. Tunisia was the first country to introduce internet in the Arab world, and Ben Ali's regime sort of advocated for teaching all aspects related to technology, and knowing that at the end these very same tools were the ones that brought the regime or advocated for the regime change that would happen.
Have you thought about, it's really the strongest is a bind when the forces of stasis and change are most equal. That's when the bind is strongest, right? Could you typologize Arab countries, which is your focus, between those that lean more towards stasis versus those that lean more towards change, and those where the bind is like really strong?
That's a difficult one. It's a kind of a trap when one tries to do that. I know it's very big in policy circles to actually try to create these types of typologies. We take that in I think in the fourth chapter. We take that on in terms of because these are happening, one, in a kind of a layered fashion, and they're happening also at the same time. So to sort of think about this as being able to put these and lock them into type of categories is very difficult. There are it is very difficult to come up with a kind of a typology in terms of trying to say which one is being more affected by the double bind.
But can't you say some are like actively trying to develop like a digital economy more than others? And so that's kind of like a measure for change.
That's definitely right?
So you say there's these three countries, UAE, Saudi, and Egypt, where there's more. But it's hard to say that there's more stasis or less stasis as a result there, because the stasis can be more too, along with the change. So it's kind of paradoxical.
Exactly. And the push towards knowledge economy is something that all countries in the region are trying to do it, right? So that is part of that digital turn. The process in which this is being executed is leading or is making them find themselves in a kind of a double bind, because how much are you going to go into this, and where do you draw the line, right? So what type of knowledge economy each country is trying to foster is also something that's worth considering in that sense.
Thank you. I wanted to turn it over to the audience. I have more questions, and so if no one has questions, I can keep asking. But
thank you so much for that. I'm just curious, was any of the research done in how the Arabic-speaking diaspora around the world has influenced, for example, that country or those regions, either people from Algerians in France doing stuff, or then moving back to those countries and kind of serving as a catalyst
Yeah, we do touch on this in various parts. We touch on this in the role of the diaspora in the early stages of the introduction of the internet, and the role that they played in this regard. We'll also touch on it in I mean, particularly the type of groups, for example, that were fostering a level of creativity and ingenuity in terms of trying to do. There were the early folks who tried to develop Arabic keyboards because none of the big companies were interested in this kind of stuff. So we talk about it in this regard. We'll also talk about it in terms of introducing a kind of a venture capital culture when we address the economy and how the economy is developing in this regard. And later on, we also discuss it under the sort of sociocultural scale, particularly the way the diaspora continuously invokes particular modes of communication and so on between the two. This is one of the major elements that perhaps has caused a kind of a different type of technology, different type of era, if you want, from in terms of change, the role that the diaspora is playing in all of this.
Steve. Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm Steve Livingston, and professor here at GW for a while, and also the founder of the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics, which I mentioned only because it's going to be relevant to what I wanted to talk to you about.
Sure.
I'm trying to get my head around the conceptual model, and looking at these kinds of issues for a long time, years. One of the things that concepts I've always relied on is this notion of the digital affordance. And affordance is simply a term, get around the deterministic treatment of the effects of technology. This chair here has, by its design, the implied use of sitting. But I think Professor Yeomans here has decided to take its affordances and turn it into a photograph. That gets at the idea. So any given technology can be used for a variety of purposes. It seems to me, looking back over this over the last 20 years that we're looking at it, that the changes are in trends in what academics look at. For the longest time prior to 2016, there's liberation technology. It's going to save the world. You know, Larry Diamond was on a roll, right? But still, at the same time, you had distant voices saying exactly what I heard you say. But wait a minute, when the activists are using a social media platform, the authorities are using that to track the. So that's always been present, just like that affordance, right? After 2016, after Brexit and Trump's election, all of a sudden, I know this because I got $5 million of it, $70 million comes online to save democracy from the very same technologies that presumably promoted democracy.
Yep.
Nothing had changed. What had changed were the incentive structures for academics. Prior to 2015, 2016, Hillary Clinton and Sherry, Blair were going around developing suitcases that could be, you know, taken in and used as a hub for revolution, right? Now we have a very different dynamic. So I guess my question to you is, has anything really changed from over the last 20 years, or is it rather our incentive structures as academics, how we see and understand the issue because of the incentive structure? Is that what's changed?
If I got your question right, what we're looking at is precisely an observation on the region itself, a region that has always been sort of seen as stuck in time. That there is a kind of a predicament of the Arab world as unchanging, as being stuck.
So it's sort of Edward Said in the digital era.
Not so well. that was the orientalizing aspect, right?
Yeah.
So yes, there was a lot of that orientalizing of the Middle East, but at the same time, there was a lot of what we talked about in terms of universalizing the digital. So all you need to do is give the Arab world, just like the learner model, right?
Yeah.
Give the Arab world a bunch of digital technologies, what Clinton was talking about, right? The suitcases, and they'll be free, right? And what we wanted to do is step out of this kind of binary logic of looking at the region. And first, we observed this notion of the digital turn, that yes, there is some kind of a change that's actually happening. So people are using these types of technologies. There is this kind of inclination that's there, but we're not going to fall to the PR brouhaha about it, of these types of announcement, because if you're living and working there the way we are, every day there's a kind of a announcement about a digital technology that's going to change people's lives, right? So whether it is oh, you no longer need to go. I mean, we didn't talk about the cultural aspect, but you no longer need to have somebody assist you to find a suitor. All you need to do is go on an online version, and there are so many of these platforms, and there you go. That solves your conundrum, right? So what we're trying to do is move away from this, and at the same time try to see how the region itself is why we're still the perception is still there that we're still stuck in time. So that's the perception.
To follow up on something he's saying, I think, like if you think back to Egypt and Facebook, before the revolution, there was a lot of pressure to accept Facebook because of the e-commerce potential and to sort of like part of the knowledge economy, right? And so there was almost like the regime had a theory about the affordances and how this technology would be used and what it would mean in terms of like revenue generation, right? But then during the revolution, there's this other affordance that emerges, one for political activism and social organizing. And so the change is driven by one vision, then there's these like consequences. And the consequences lead to a change in regime policy, and they try to control it. And that's another force for stasis. So like, is there almost like oftentimes some sort of temporal aspect, cause and effect, and
there's that, and there's the idea of, okay, to what extent, and here's the biggest question. So if we end up with if we're subscribing to this idea of the double bind, then the region ends up being stuck. And that would then lead us to a very pessimistic version of what's going on, right? So what is changing is precisely what you're talking about. Once the rules have changed, this is when people step out and create a different rule for things. So when the government set this up as a kind of for the knowledge economy, and people said, no, we can use it for a different, altered the affordances. They changed that, right? But then the government went back and changed those rules on them again, right? And then it became something that's sort of tracking them. So it's that kind of these kind of dynamics, and sometimes contradictory dynamics, that we want to try to capture. And we try to capture in this process.
I know you're also working on a book, a long-term project about Saudi and alternative media, and obviously you were just back there recently. So I think if you could like unpack a little bit about what we see happening in Saudi according to this analytic, it might help. Because I mean, of course, there's MBS, and MBS is a political variable that's kind of maybe separate from technology. I don't know if there's some sort of technology explanation for how he rose to power. I guess, well, it's hereditary and everything. He was a crown prince, so it was sort of inevitable, right? So there's no technology story there, it's just politics and hereditary rule. But then there's like this technology story that's happening also.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where to start with this.
Sorry, maybe it's not a good example in case you don't much.
No, but I mean, definitely that story of the digital didn't start with MBS.
Right.
I mean, it started with the introduction of YouTube. If you want to, like if you want to term it then, it created a kind of an impetus for many young people to actually use this as a kind of an alternative form of communication, where they could bypass and have different access to proclaiming their own voice. And this is not necessarily political in the strict sense of the term. So there's that aspect. So it started before. He comes in and he creates a huge impetus where it becomes more structural. The dynamics that he created, in addition to the kind of funding that he's affording, both within the country, but also the kind of partnerships that he's building for the country. I don't know if that's
So do you see more change there than stasis in this digital relationship?
Again, a lot of change that's actually happening, but also but those very same tools are used for both.
Yeah,
That's the
line.
thesis. Yeah. No.
Well,
I was just gonna say I remember when I was studying international relations like 20 years ago, they would talk about the big ditch theory. And then
big ditch.
the big ditch theory, this
Ditch.
should be ditch.
Ditch.
So as imagine you're approaching and there's like a big ditch and it seems really big as you get to it. And then when you pass it, if you look back, the further you go, the smaller it gets. And eventually you don't see it at all. To me, this technology and every one of these new technologies, almost like a big dish theory, seems like it's going to be colossal. It's going to have a big impact on you once you get over it. Like, 10 minutes later, you can't even see it anymore because it's the exact same.
It's like a dissertation.
There you go. But getting to your point, I wanted to, that was just like a brief kind of point I wanted to raise. But I was going to ask a question. Are there some intervening variables that could potentially explain this? And I'm sorry if I missed it when you were giving your presentation, but I looked at a kind of similar area of research around the introduction of new technology, mobile phones, social media, and whether it increases political violence. Now, political violence is probably a reflection of political change. And so researchers have found in those places where two intervening variables are placed, there tends to be little political violence that's measured that increases. One is media landscape, which is rich and diverse. We introduce mobile phones in those environments that doesn't seem to be increased in political violence. And in places where there's just greater democracy, we introduce new technologies like cell phones, there doesn't be an increase in political violence. Where you don't have those things going on, then there does seem to be measured increase in political violence. Now that can also be explained by measurement bias itself, but putting that aside, in your analysis, did you find intervening variables that explain political change and lack of political change?
I'm not sure we could. I'm not sure we went into this approach of sort of this kind of like measurement approach in that sense, because what we're looking at are dynamics. So it's not a kind of like a causality aspect approach.
And there's markets which are big focus for your analysis.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's hard to. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at 22 countries in that sense. So looking at kind of patterns and dynamics that are there.
So certainly, like you wouldn't. So one thing I was thought about was about regime type. There's a classic divide between like the monarchies, the non-monarchies. But there's no pattern that falls on that line.
There's no pattern that falls under those lines, and plus these are constantly changing. I mean, it's not, you were talking about Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia today is not Saudi Arabia of 2017 or 2016.
Yeah.
On various levels. I'm talking everyday life. Saudi Arabia is completely different.
Yeah.
So it's not just in terms of sort of like the policies and the regulation and so on that has changed. Again, when you have states that are not only acting as regulators but also as the financiers of of the kind of change that's happening. UAE was a pioneer as a state, was a pioneer in terms of sort of pushing towards e-commerce, but at the same time, with e-commerce came e-government, right? So you have these types of so even the typology of monarchies is we tend to think about it as very much sort of stuck. So that also like there are various typologies within that typology. In that sense.
Yeah, even like rentier state versus non-rentier state.
I was also gonna ask, how about economic disparity as a variable, or meeting a minimum level of like economic standard, like in both rich or Gulf states, they just give people basic income and things like that. So there's less drivers of grievances that might lead to climate change.
I mean,
Versus other factors.
that's really that's another dimension. So think about a country like Jordan, for example. It became a major hub of innovation when it comes to the digital. One of the first companies that came out of there was Maktub, for example. It was the first email in Arabic, but then it branched out. It did an eBay version. It did all sorts of things. But Maktub didn't become as extremely big until it moved part of its operation to the UAE. So to say it is because of the UAE, or it is because of being in Jordan, or is it because this group of individuals that developed developed a particular type of skills, tapped into a particular market, and provided a whole region with tools that they can use in a language of their own, right? At a time when none of the big ones were interested in this. So again, to pinpoint to one or the other sort of excludes a whole range of dynamics that each one of them played a role in the growth of this particular company, for example.
Dr. Shana, you have a question?
Thanks. This is a great talk, very interesting. I'm interested really in the sort of the way labor factors into it, and specifically sort of automation, right? So you mentioned, for example, like financial inclusion, right? This sort of banking the unbanked, or mobile, lending and financial literacy campaigns, which have basically made a lot of money for people who developed these apps and immiserated all the people who are using them, right? Because it's not about telling someone how to use a bank account, it's about paying them a wage where they put money into the bank account, right? So and then there's been the sort of, so you remove all of those, the sort of labor that was part of this like formal banking sector, right? Kareem, right, as that app was successful for Uber, right, for the investors, but not for the Arab taxi drivers, right? People could have a business by it. And now, of course, the Uber is sort of not functioning so great anymore, right? The prices are going up. It's harder to get an Uber. It's the same thing, right, happening in all of these markets. All of those people got pushed out. And then when you think about AI or anything sort of like this, they show you these digital platforms and they say, look at all this stuff that's sort of running itself. And you're like, oh, well, actually there's, a content moderation farm in the basement in the Philippines that's actually doing all the work that people think is being done, is being automated, right? So there's all of these ways that labor, even e-government, right? The bureaucrats who used to work in these sort of wage labor, sort of middle class positions, they're gone. So it's sort of, to me, it seems like just a single line, and that it's just been bad.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'll take your last example, the one about the bureaucrats. They're not gone. That's
Right.
That's the whole point, right? The whole point is that we seem to think that these by introducing these types of technologies, that we're doing away with this class of bureaucrats. But unless we develop the kind of embeddedness that is done on a sociocultural, political, and economic level, you're not going to be able to get rid of them. And in many ways, that's the kind of double bind that we're talking about, because what you're doing, you're introducing these types of technologies with the promise of change, yet at the same time, these individuals are not gone. There are other places where certain apps, for example, were very good at tapping into the unbanked and sort of embedding themselves into the economic system that exists. So many apps, thinking of one, Anghami, for example, the music streaming service. What they did, they partnered up with the telecom providers, and the bill comes in with your telecom, with your mobile bill at the end of the month. So whichever way you pay for that, you're paying for your subscription for the music. But again, even then, it comes in with other problems related to the fact that we're used. I mean, as a culture, there's a kind of a culture of the free, right? The music is, like I'm getting my music from the radio, and radio is free, right? So why should I be paying for access to music through an app? Or I'm able to pay 50 cents to get a hard drive, or a flip with all the music that I want, right? Why should I be paying a subscription and not actually physically own the music? So then you'd have to work on the kind of cultural embeddedness. How do we get people to convince them that you get 50 million songs now with that kind of subscription that you have? So a lot of that's creating the kind of double bind where it doesn't seem that there is a change, but that change is incremental, and it's also uneven. So countries that can afford, where the socioeconomic levels are high, people are able to subscribe, and for them it's a kind of a breeze, and they moved into what many are calling post-digital stage. We're looking here at primarily at the Gulf states, whereas in other places there isn't that type of buy-in. So we think that they are stuck.
Are there any questions from the? Okay. Is it till 4? Okay. So if there are no other questions, please join me in thanking Professor Khalil.
Thank you.
And thank you to the Institute for Middle East Studies for sponsoring this, and to Steve Livingston for helping found the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, in which Joe is our visiting scholar this year. What's that? Yeah.
Two different ones.
Yeah, it's the other institute. Thank you.
Thank you.